Everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I think I know almost all of you, but just in case, my name is Delaney. Work here at the Center for Cooperative Media on the Collaborative Journalism Resource Hub team with Amy Maestas and Liza Gross. They are also both here. Think we will have a really great actionable webinar today about tracking the impact of your work in your communities. I know this is a really big topic for everyone. This will be the Hub's last monthly webinar for the year. We are taking a little break for the holidays. Hopefully you will all find a way to slow down a little bit in the coming months as well. But then beginning in January, we will be back once a month with these webinars. We have a great lineup of topics cooking up, but if you have a suggestion, please always do email us and Amy will drop that link to send a note to the Hub team in the chat. Before I get into our guest speaker for today, a couple other things. The first is that the best way to keep up with these webinars as well as other collaborative happenings is subscribing to our newsletter. Amy is also going to drop in the chat the link for you to sign up. Second, you can find all of these past webinars on YouTube. Not lots of times, often people will say, hey, I missed this one. I had to miss this one. I really am sad I missed this. And they're always on YouTube. And Amy is going to put that link in the chat as well. And then just as always, as we always do, we will be emailing you the recording, the slides, the transcript, speaker contact information, any links from today's webinar. So you will receive that as long as you are here right now. So you will be getting that. So we are so happy to have Danny Hayes with us here today to talk about how the Statewide News Collective examined the reach and influence of 3 independent local news organizations: New Hampshire Public Radio, Bridge, Michigan, and Montana Free Press. Some of you have probably heard of these organizations, heard of the Statewide News Collective. You'll hear all about it from Danny. Some of you also who were at CJS also heard a little bit about this. So if you want a refresher, you had to miss that. This is also a great opportunity. Danny is a professor of political science at George Washington University. His research and teaching focus on the media, public opinion, and elections. Exciting stuff. And Danny led this research using a blend of quantitative and qualitative methods. We will get into both to conclude that audiences of these outlets express a high level of trust in their reporting, are more informed about public affairs, and are more engaged in civic life than other residents. The research also highlights that the impact of local journalism extends across these multiple dimensions, from information and trust to participation and community connection. So Danny, thank you so much for being here to tell us all about it. And I will turn it over to Danny just shortly. We are going to do questions at the end here. Danny has some slides. He'll share all about his work. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions. And at that time, we'll all sort of gather back and you can come off mute and ask away. So Danny, if you have your slides, it's time for the traditional sharing of the slides.
Well, thanks, Delaney, and thanks to you and Amy for inviting me to come speak to the group. And thank you all for coming. It's great to get a chance to talk to you about this research project that I worked on last year with the Lenfest Institute, as Delaney described. If you have seen me talk about this before, it's my condolences. I'm sorry. I probably only have the same jokes too, so you'll have to suffer through those. And now that I know this is the last one that you're doing for the year, I wish I had some, like some kind of fireworks to send you out on. But I'll do what I can to make it worth your time. As Delaney said, I'm going to describe a project that I was involved with the Lenfest Institute that was designed to measure and describe what we call the community impact of a number of news organizations that were connected to the Lenfest Institute's Statewide News Collective. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself before I describe to you how the project came about. I was a journalist 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, I guess, after I graduated from college at a little newspaper in West Texas called the San Angelo Standard-Times. And I did that for a few years before getting interested in politics and political science and went back to get my PhD. And so my teaching and research as an academic has largely been focused on questions of the relationship between media and politics. And the last 10 years or so has been focused on the way the changes to the local news environment have impacted politics in the United States at the local level. And the collaboration that I'm going to describe to you today, this project came about through some shared conversations that I had with Amy Kovac-Ashley, who at the time, 2 years ago, was the head of national programs at Lenfest. And so I'm going to start by talking about that, and then just give you a sense of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the motivation for the project. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the study, of what we did, highlight a few of the key findings that I think are, kind of the most salient points for thinking about the measurement of community impact and what we found. I'm going to talk a little bit about adapting the model that I'm going to describe for newsrooms or, collaboratives or organizations that might have varying levels of resources or expertise or, desire to do this kind of work. And then talk a little at the end about what I think are some of the benefits of measuring community impact based on what the organizations that participated in the project told us afterward and the way that they were able to use the information that we found. And I should also say that, as Delaney said, be happy. I'm not going to talk for an hour, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. But if you have questions, if anything I'm saying is confusing or you want some clarification on something, I don't mind at all if you pipe up and ask something in the middle, if that would help clarify the what I'm describing. So as I said, this came about because of conversations that I had with Amy Kovac-Ashley at a conference a couple of years ago that were basically related to her kind of growing desire to think about how to measure the impact of especially a lot of the new kinds of local journalism outlets that have been emerging over the last couple of decades, digital-only outlets and others. And my own interest in trying to move the academic research beyond the questions that had focused on the consequences of the decline of local news, which had been a lot of my own focus. And so I think this desire to sort of do both of these things, we discovered that there was like a lot of commonality in what we were thinking about. And so what we decided to do was to develop this project whose key question was to try to answer, to focus on this question of what is the community impact of local independent journalism. One reason for thinking about this was that, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of research on the decline of local news, as many of you know, but there's just a lot less on its reemergence in different forms. Both the emergence of hyperlocal or much smaller news outlets covering smaller communities, but also the rise of nonprofit journalism and obviously the philanthropic efforts that are now devoted to supporting those kinds of news organizations. There just isn't as much known about what the impact or the role that those kinds of outlets play in their community. And so some of what this project was designed to do was to try to address what we viewed as kind of a gap in our understanding about that development. The other thing that I think was an observation that we both shared was that news outlets often track legislative or policy impact pretty closely. I mean, this was certainly true when I was a news reporter, is that when we always knew in the newsroom when, an elected official resigned because of reporting that we'd done, or there was some kind of action taken by a government or some other institution as a result of some kind of project that we had undertaken. But the kind of impact that I think news organizations make on a day-to-day basis, which is keeping the community informed, helping people engage with what's happening in their community, that kind of impact is, I think, typically more impressionistic in newsrooms and for news organizations, which I think is, for very good reason, because it can be quite difficult to measure. It's hard to sort of systematically track those kinds of things. But at its core, most newsrooms have this as a really an animating feature of why they're doing what they're doing. And so it seemed to us quite important to try to develop some ways to systematically identify a type of impact that is more mundane and really in some ways, but also really fundamental to the entire enterprise of journalism at any level, but certainly at the local level. And then the third reason was just that it's clear, especially in the current economic and financial environment for news outlets and the role that philanthropy and grant making is playing, is that being able to demonstrate the relevance of local journalism is particularly important in ways that are systematic and rigorous as a way of just demonstrating to potential funders and others that the work that these organizations are doing is really making a meaningful difference in their communities or in people's lives. So that was one thing that we saw as a potential benefit of trying to develop a project like this. And the other was that the hope was that it would also help news organizations identify areas for growth, regardless of whether we found that these outlets that we were partnering with had an impact on their community. Whether we found that they did or not, we'd hopefully be able to give them some information about places or ways that they could try to grow their audience or identify areas of coverage that might be beneficial or would be particularly useful for them. So for all these reasons, it seemed that trying to do this in a kind of a rigorous way would be valuable. As I mentioned, impact can be defined a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different kinds of impact. And I think even in the context of what we might think of as community impact, there's all kinds of ways to think about that. But I just want to try to be specific about what we were focused on in this project as I then move into kind of describing what we did. One, I think, reasonable indicator of community impact is that consumers of an outlet kind of come to place their trust in that source of information, and also believe that it is addressing their community's sort of key concerns, whether that is, about specific issues that it is covering or the representation of different groups within the community. And so we thought that it was useful to think about impact as manifesting in the attitudes that consumers have about the outlet as one way we might think of as kind of an antecedent condition to really sort of have a fundamental effect on a community. So that's one thing that we were focused on. Another thing we're focused on is the way that consumers feel about the information that they're getting from an outlet and how it helps sort of keep them informed. So another indicator of the kind of community impact that we were interested in is that it made that people came to feel informed about what was happening in their community, and that they actually are informed. And those two things are related, but they are different. Feeling informed is important because it's a way of giving people a sense of efficacy. But actually being informed is also important because you don't want people to feel informed but actually be misinformed. And so trying to measure the extent to which news outlets are actually providing people with factual information and helping them actually know what is objectively happening in their communities also seems like another important way that local journalism can provide really positive community impact. And then the final thing was that was a focus on civic engagement, which probably was the main focus in the project, is looking at whether consumers are engaged in their community and then mobilized to participate as a result of their engagement with the outlets that they're getting information from. And so all of those are ways of thinking about, like the sort of, as I said, kind of day-to-day or more mundane ways that news outlets make an impact on their community. And the challenge then is thinking about how do you actually identify the extent to which news organizations are actually doing that. So as I said earlier, and as Delaney indicated, what we did was to partner with 3 outlets that were part of Lenfest's Statewide News Collective. This is a group of statewide news outlets that kind of serve as a community that get support from Lenfest, but also sort of are collaborate and support each other. And those outlets were New Hampshire Public Radio, Bridge, Michigan, and Montana Free Press. We, in conjunction with Lenfest, we had a call for applications for news outlets that were interested in participating in the study. And then we selected these three from the group of outlets that applied. If you're interested in more details about why we selected these three, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Briefly, what we were trying to do is include news organizations that were similar in one respect. They were all nonprofits and independent news outlets, but also varied in some important ways. One is just their sort of state of development, like or stage of development. New Hampshire Public Radio has been around since the early 1980s. Bridge, Michigan was founded in 2011, and Montana Free Press was founded in 2016, I believe. So they were all sort of like at different stages of life as news outlets. The other thing, we wanted some, geographic diversity. So we've got a New England outlet, a Midwest outlet, and a outlet from the western part of the United States that represented sort of or covered sort of different kinds of communities and constituencies. And so, so the idea was to have a somewhat diverse group of outlets, and in addition to the fact that New Hampshire Public Radio is a radio station and delivers its content in a lot of different ways, and Bridge and Montana Free Press are both print only or digital, not print, but digital text outlets. So the core of the project, there's a couple different parts of the project, but I'm just going to talk about the surveys that we conducted here. The core of the project was basically to conduct statewide surveys in each state. And we did this in the spring and early summer of 2024. The surveys were, we did this in partnership with market research and polling firm Qualtrics. The sampling frame that we designed in each state was designed to basically draw representative samples from each state, meaning, a sample that is representative of the population at large, not just readers of these publications or users of these outlets. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the idea here is that what we were trying to do is conduct surveys of people who were both, familiar with and users of these outlets in each state, but also people who were not, which is a key part of the analysis that we conducted. So the surveys we conducted in Michigan, we did it in April. Montana, we did it in May, and then in June in New Hampshire. The sample sizes for each study varied, largely as a function of the size of the population and the expense of drawing large samples from these smaller states. But we had about 2,000 people in Michigan, and then a little bit more than 600 in Montana, in New Hampshire. And so these sample sizes are large enough for us to make some reasonable inferences in the analysis that we do. So the survey is focused on a few different things that correspond to those indicators of community impact that I described. So one thing we were interested in doing is asking residents of these states how they got news about, state, like where they got news about what was happening in their state and in their communities. So we gave people options of, ask people, like, do you get news from these various outlets, which always, of course, included questions about whether they got news from the particular statewide news collective outlet in each state, so that we would actually have a pretty good comprehensive understanding of the different places that people got news from. We also asked them about their attitudes about the outlets that they got news from. So, if somebody said that they got news from Bridge, Michigan, we would ask them about how trustworthy, how much trust they had in the information they got from those outlets. And we asked some broader questions about their attitudes toward state and local journalism, and some other aspects of news reporting in their state and community. And then a big part of the survey was asking them about their different forms of civic engagement. This included things that were explicitly political, like turning out to vote in elections and participating in political meetings or rallies or contacting elected officials, but these were also broader indicators of engagement like volunteering in the community, donating money to a community organization, and other indicators that are not explicitly political. So it was designed to capture a fairly wide variety of activities that we might categorize as civic engagement. And then finally, we had some of these surveys. In the surveys, we had some portions of them that were more qualitative in nature, where we asked people open-ended questions, in particular about coverage that they had been exposed to or things that they learned about from the various statewide news collective outlets, for people who got news from those outlets, so that we could get a little bit more of a textural feel for how these outlets' coverage affected people. I'm going to show you mostly results from the quantitative data, but I will talk a little bit about the qualitative evidence as well. And of course, like having some qualitative evidence allows you to get under the hood a little bit of what the more quantitative data are telling us. So before I turn to the results, I want to highlight a couple of things that I think are relevant for folks who work in newsrooms or work with various news outlets. Most news outlets these days, of course, do surveys, which are typically audience surveys, as a way of gauging what their audience likes or doesn't like, or how they feel about the work that they're doing. And I think those audience surveys obviously have a lot of value for most news organizations. The approach that we undertook was different than audience surveys in a couple of important ways, in ways that are, I think, relevant for measuring something like impact. The goal here was for us to compare consumers of the statewide news collective outlets, people who got news from those outlets and people who didn't, as one route to identifying the impact that they had. That is, one of the things you're going to see that I'm going to show you is, for example, what does it look like when we compare the levels of civic engagement among people who got news from the statewide news collective outlet and people who didn't? And in audience surveys, you obviously don't have a comparison group. You can't make a comparison between the people who are filling out the survey because they are part of your audience and people who were not. And so the approach that we're describing gives us much more leverage in actually identifying patterns that are consistent with the actual impact of the journalism on the people who consume it by comparing them to people who do not. And you'll see some examples of that when I present the results. The other thing is that the comparisons that the surveys allow us to draw are really also helpful for facilitating the interpretations of the findings in ways that are that I think are different than audience surveys. The example that I think of is that in an audience survey, if you ask respondents who, how much trust do you have in the information that you get from us as a news source? If, say 75% of people say that they have a lot of trust in the information that they get from the news source, that's good. But it's hard to understand, it's hard to know what that means because you don't have anything to compare it to. And so one of the things that we are able to do, because we asked people not only about their consumption of the statewide news collective outlet, but also other sources of state and local news that they got information from, we can then make comparisons, for example, comparing the trustworthiness of the statewide news collective outlets to other outlets in their state, as a way to actually to draw conclusions about, what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of these outlets. And then finally, when you do audience surveys, the people who are willing to fill out audience surveys are typically people who are, pretty big fans of the site or the outlet. It's just a reality of how people respond to surveys. And so the survey design that we have and the way that we sampled people more, designed to be a representative survey of the state, it helps ensure that the respondents that we have are not simply self-selected boosters of the outlet, and so can give us a more kind of clear-eyed picture on what people actually do think. So I'm gonna move forward and talk a little bit about some of the key takeaways. I'm going to start by just describing something related to what I just mentioned, which is the way that users of the statewide news collective outlets rated the trustworthiness of the statewide news collective outlets compared to people who were users of other sites. So what this graph shows you is the percentage of respondents in each state, so New Hampshire, Michigan, and Montana, who said that they had a lot of trust in the news sources they used. And what the graph shows you is a comparison among, in the blue, people who were statewide news collective users, meaning they, in New Hampshire, they got news from New Hampshire Public Radio, in Michigan, Bridge, Michigan, and in Montana, Montana Free Press, compared to the ratings that were given by people who got news from other outlets. And the takeaway from this graph is that the statewide news collective outlets were rated, slightly more trustworthy by between 1 and 4 points than other outlets. These are not huge differences, and I certainly wouldn't interpret this as evidence that the statewide news collective outlets are dramatically more trustworthy in the eyes of their users than are other outlets. But it does suggest that at a minimum, they are sort of at least perceived as credible as other outlets in the state, which is, I think, pretty notable, especially for an outlet like Montana Free Press, which at the time of we did the survey had only been around for 8 years and was basically polling at more or less the same level as longer established newspapers and other news outlets in the state. And so this is one indicator that these outlets had developed a level of trust suggestive of impact that they were having on the state. On their consumers. In the same vein, we asked another question asking people how well they thought the outlets that they got news from addressed the most important issues in their state. And this is a graph showing you the percentage of respondents in each state who said that the outlet did it either very well or somewhat well. Again, the blue represents statewide news collective outlets, and the orange represents other outlets in the state. And so here there's a little bit more variation, a little bit higher in New Hampshire for the statewide news collective outlets, and in Montana, a little bit lower in Michigan. But again, this is probably sort of the best conclusion here is that the outlets are viewed as covering issues about as well as other outlets in the state. I think the more interesting questions, though, are about how people's information levels, about how they feel, and about what they know. And so the next part of the surveys were designed to find out, like our statewide news collective outlet users, readers, listeners, do they feel better informed, and are they better informed than people who got news from other places? And here the results were a lot more unequivocal. So this is a graph that shows you the percentage of respondents who said that they felt very or somewhat informed about issues facing their state. And what you can see is that across the board, by margins that range from 17 points in New Hampshire to 30 points in Michigan, people who got news from the statewide news collective outlet in their state were much more likely to say that they felt informed about state issues. But of course, as I said, feeling informed is not the same thing as being informed. And so we also asked some people what you might think of as quiz questions about things that were happening in their state. I'm a professor, so I'm like contractually obligated to give people a quiz from time to time. So we asked people if they could name the person who represented them in their state house district. That is, in the state legislature, in the lower house and the house, if they could name the person who represented them. And when we did that, we found again the same thing, a similar pattern, which is that not only did the statewide news collective consumers feel better informed, but they actually were. So as one example, in Michigan, 28% of people who got news from other outlets, who didn't get news from Bridge, Michigan, said that that were actually able to name their state House representative, but that was 45% among Bridge, Michigan readers. One of the questions that, like always arises from data like this is the extent to which we can interpret these as causal. That is, how much is this about the Statewide News Collective outlets' journalism and their reporting leading people to be more informed, and how much of this is just that people who are more informed are gravitating to these sources of news. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but the spoiler is that it's actually both. Both of those things are true, and I'll talk a little bit about how to think about that in the context of impact. The next thing we were interested in, and the final thing that we were interested in, is not just about people's information levels or how they feel about how informed they are, but whether they are actually more engaged. And so we asked people about whether they had participated in a wide variety of civic engagement activities, including, having voted in a recent state or local election, volunteering in the community, and this whole list of things that you can see on this slide. And for every one of these activities, the people who got news from the Statewide News Collective outlet were much more likely, or I should say that they were more likely, not much more likely in every case, but they were more likely to have done one of these things in the last year than people who didn't get news from that outlet. A finding that is, again, consistent with the idea that these outlets are providing information to people that is then leading them to engage in various ways in their community, whether that's related to politics or in some other fashion. Interestingly, we found that the differences between Statewide News Collective users and non-users on these civic engagement questions were largest for the activities that we might describe as the most costly, meaning the things that required more effort. So if you look at the graph, you can see that there's not a huge difference in the voter turnout rate between Statewide News Collective users and non-users. And I think one explanation for that is that, turning out to vote is not the most onerous form of political participation. It does obviously require some work and effort. You have to plan for it. You have to go be willing to do it. But it's also the case that, it's a one-time thing. But volunteering in the community or attending a state and local political meeting are more burdensome forms of participation. And so what we found is that the gap between people who did and did not get news from the Statewide News Collective outlets tended to be biggest on those more effortful forms of political participation. Another thing that is consistent with that is that we also found a pretty significant difference between people who were interested in running for political office. So obviously the percentage of Americans who would ever actually run for office and would even consider it is low, but it was significantly higher in every state among the respondents who were users of the Statewide News Collective who got news from those outlets. Again, suggesting that, in what is a pretty costly form of political participation, that there was a pretty strong relationship between those two things. And so if you look at the report that we produced about this, you can see some more details of these analyses, but the takeaway is that, on a variety of dimensions, the evidence that these news outlets are having, a real impact on their community is pretty strong when you look at the quantitative data. The qualitative data help us understand kind of what that actually means on the ground. So as I mentioned, we asked respondents who were users of the Statewide News Collective outlets to tell us in their own words about the way that the coverage had an impact on them. Like, what was it? Do you remember a story, or what was it that actually was had affected you? Overall, we found that about 1/3 of the readers or listeners of these outlets could recall a specific story that had affected them directly. And there were a few themes that arose from that. One of them was just the ability to kind of raise their awareness of an issue. So as one example, a number of respondents in the survey mentioned the reporting that NHPR had done during the pandemic and the way that that had helped them understand, like what the risks of COVID were, and like various as the information about masking practices and all kinds of other things were swirling about, that helped them sort of understand those issues much better. So kind of as just an example of the way that that kind of coverage might help someone feel better informed in what was, of course, a pretty fraught time for everybody. We also found a number of respondents across the states that described the emotional impact that coverage had on them. So one theme came from Bridge, Michigan had done a number of stories about rising unemployment rates in Michigan and the effects that that was having on families in the state. And there were a number of readers who mentioned that it really sort of brought home what the economic upheaval that Michigan was undergoing was actually doing in the state, and in some cases in their own communities. And so that was another way of understanding how this coverage was actually making it down and having an effect on people's lives directly. And then there were a number of respondents who also talked about how learning something from these sites had actually caused them to take some action. My favorite one was, like a Montana Free Press reader who was describing the site's environmental coverage and said, "I will never litter again as a result of that." So what might seem like a fairly sort of small example of impact, but one that is quite concrete. And so these qualitative data, sort of helped us get a better sense of what we were finding in the quantitative data. I'm just going to talk for about 5 more minutes, and the last couple things I want to talk about are one, first to talk a little bit about how this model might be adapted for different newsrooms, and I want to talk a little bit about a couple different ways of doing what we did. One is like the approach of trying to do fairly large scale surveys at a statewide level, which is one approach. But of course, like the resources and the expertise for that kind of thing are is going to vary. Small newsrooms or small groups of outlets are simply not going to have the kind of resources or time, staff, otherwise, or money to do this kind of thing. But we think that our approach can be scaled up or down, or scaled down depending on an organization or a group of organizations' needs. And I'm going to describe just a couple ways to think about that. So thinking about the surveys that we conducted, there are some real advantages to the approach that we took. Like, one is just that you have a large scale, and if you design the surveys in the right way, it generates some ability to generalize beyond obviously just the sample that you've drawn, to generalize to the population of the state or the community, whatever it is that you're interested in studying. At the same time, there are some real limitations. One, it's obviously relatively expensive. It requires some facility with data analysis and people who have expertise that can, analyze the data in that way. And it's also the case that surveys are just simply not going to be suitable for small markets or geographic areas served by smaller news outlets, because it's just not feasible to do large scale surveys in this way in those communities, and it may not actually even be a particularly good way to understand impact in a smaller community. On the other hand, focus groups, which some of you may have been involved in, can also be a very valuable way to do something that is quite similar to what we did, but just on a smaller scale for a lot less money, in a way that doesn't require a great deal of technical expertise. Focus groups tend to be, not very expensive. They're pretty easy to implement. And as the qualitative data from the project suggests, there is a lot that you can learn from a little bit more in-depth understanding of how community members engage with local journalism. and the benefit of this is that you still get what I would describe as, valuable systematic evidence about the role that a news outlet's journalism plays in shaping the lives of its audience and its community, even without having, a survey of the sort that we used in this project. One of the limitations, of course, is that when you do focus groups, it's just harder to generalize beyond the particular participants. But I don't see that as a barrier to seeking to apply the same kind of framework that we've used in this project to a focus group approach, which I think can be quite valuable. If you look in the two reports that we produced, though, on the left is the one that just describes the main findings, but the right one, and I know that Amy and Delaney shared this with you all when you signed up for the webinar, but we have a pretty detailed description about this sort of a guide about how one might implement a similar project to track community impact. And so hopefully that could be valuable to folks who might be thinking about this kind of thing, even if doing surveys of the sort that we did are not really feasible or even desirable. And I'll just close by highlighting some of what we learned from following up with the NHPR in Bridge, Michigan and Montana Free Press staff about the way that they were able to use the information that we got from these studies. One was just that it was clear that the outlets all were able to gain sort of like a longer term perspective on the way that their journalism was having an impact. One of the staff at Bridge, Michigan said that it helped view their work, quote, in the totality of the year as a whole, as opposed to the daily work immediately in view. And again, I think, like for news organizations that are often, need to think in the long term, I think that can be quite valuable to think about, like what the overtime contribution that is being made to a community. The other thing is to be able to identify strategies to expand an audience. Montana Free Press was a good example of this. One of the things that they learned from the survey that they hadn't known before was how large the audiences for radio and TV, or that were, especially people who were interested in local affairs. And so they decided to undertake some efforts to try to get more of their content on the radio and television by developing partnerships to have their reporters go on local television or local radio to talk about the reporting they'd done as a way to get their content to audiences that weren't going to come to their site and read about it. In the NHPR study, we also found that they saw some evidence that they had sort of more strength potentially with younger audiences than they thought that they might. And so that is helping them develop some new efforts to try to target a new generation of listeners and readers. And then finally, I think there's just a lot of value in being able to provide, concrete measurable impact of the potential for funders. All of the outlets, I think, mentioned this to us when we talked to them, but Montana Free Press folks told us being able to show the tangible impact of our reporting will strengthen our case for continued and increased support. And so having third party or at least some systematic evidence of the kind of impact that your organization is working for, I think is really valuable for those purposes. Just to say a couple things wrapping up. One is to return to the thing that I mentioned earlier about whether it's reasonable to draw conclusions, to infer that these are causal effects, that is, the journalism is causing people to become informed or engaged, or these are just differences in the audiences that gravitate toward these types of outlets. And as I mentioned, the answer is kind of likely both. If you look in the report that we produced, the appendix has some additional sort of more complicated statistical analysis to make the case that these are probably causally related. But even if it was only a selection effect where audiences who are interested in these kinds of things are gravitating toward these outlets, in my view, that's actually still a form of impact, because if you're reaching the people who are already the most engaged in the community, that in itself is a pretty strong justification for the impact that you're having. Um, and I think the evidence suggests that there's just multifaceted ways that these outlets have a community impact, which I don't think is a surprise to probably anybody on this call. But I think it's really important to have that kind of evidence. And then, as we talked about, I think there's various ways to scale this up and down depending on resources. Um, I hope that's useful. And I know there were a couple of things in the chat that I didn't get to take a look at, so I'd be happy to respond to anything that any questions that folks might have. I'll stop sharing my screen so we can have the screen free.
Danny, this is really helpful. There are a couple of questions in the chat. One of which is from Melinda Kleins, who's project manager of the Southwest Michigan Collaborative. And it's a good question, and I'm just want to respond really quickly from the Hub's perspective, is that she was asking how all of this work around tracking community impact translates from individual news outlets, which you did. And there are a lot of strategies and guidance out there for that, and how does that translate to how collaboratives, which has multiple news outlets, can do it as an impact? And the good news there is that the Hub is leading the work in creating a framework for how collaboratives, which is multiple organizations involved, news and otherwise, can track impact on their community. And after the first of the year, we will be taking this and sharing it out. And so it'll answer that exact question about how people who are leading collaboratives can get there. And then the other question comes from Stella, who was asking if other outlets are state level news outlets or national. And I'll let you take that. And then once Danny answers that, if anybody else has questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat or to come off mute and ask them in our next 9 minutes.
Yeah, well, that's great. It's great to hear too about the that resource that you're going to be putting out. Stella, the other outlets were all other state and local media outlets. So we gave people a lengthy list in each state of other places that they might get state and local news. So that's what those are. Those are not national news outlets.
May I also add something to the previous question around how does it work with collaboratives, or how does it apply to collaborative, but even also to individual ones? Most of you that have worked with us for several years, like Diana, Rich, many people who are here on this call, Dawn, know that one of the things that we have always advised is pick one topic and focus on that. And then that makes it much easier to be able to measure impact over time than if you as a collaborative are working on many, many topics. And our tendency as journalists is, okay, been there, done that, did this story, and then let me move on to the other story, and let me move on to the other story. But many of the intractable issues that we're trying to cover in our communities require more than just one and done. And the other day, someone referenced the movie Spotlight. I don't know if you recall, for those of you who saw it, how Marty Baron had to stop his reporters from publishing like the first 5 stories that came out of their initial investigation, and said, wait, there's something more there. There's something more. Let's keep digging, because the impulse was, all right, we have a story. Let's go with it. But then that conspires against, or it doesn't help when we really want to build impact over time on a topic.
Yeah, and one of the things that's a good point, because one of the things I didn't mention is that one possibility, again, this will vary from news outlet to news outlet, or collaborative to collaborative as it's doing this, is that ideally, being able to do this over time is really great, because as I mentioned, the importance of the having a point of comparison to interpret some of these results. If you do this over time, you get multiple data points basically, and it gives you a better sense of how the work that you're doing. You can just you just develop a much better sense of how the work that you're doing is making a contribution to the community by seeing that evolution over time. So a couple of the questions that are in the chat. So the civic engagement measures that we used included a battery that was actually identical across states, which is asking people about different forms of political participation, like turning out to vote in a state and local election or contacting a state or local elected official, as well as things like donating to a community organization or volunteering in the community. So those were the same across the states, and the findings were actually pretty consistent from state to state. There weren't big differences in the relationship between people's likelihood of getting news from the statewide news collective outlet and their likelihood of doing those different things across the state. They were all pretty similar. So the question about how to reach the statewide news collective consumers. So we partnered with a market research firm, Qualtrics, that was able to basically draw samples from the state, irrespective of whether people were consumers of the outlet or not. So, like for example, in Michigan, I think about 18% of the respondents in the survey said that they either sometimes or often got news from Bridge, Michigan. So that means that 82% of the respondents in the survey did not. And that's part of what gives us the leverage to sort of make the comparisons that I think give us some evidence about impact in these cases. If you're doing surveys like that, designing the sampling process to ensure that you're getting, as representative a sample of the state or the community that you're interested in as possible is really key, because you need to have non-consumers to make those comparisons. In the document that describes, like our kind of how-to guide, we discussed this a little bit in the context of focus groups, because focus groups, you're not going to be doing large-scale telephone or online sampling. But I think there's a lot of ways to reach people through message boards, other kinds of online places who are not consumers of a particular outlet. And if you offer people, like small compensation, $20 or something, and a slice of pizza or something, you can get people to come and do focus groups, and you can get a fairly diverse cross-section of a community, even if it's not necessarily representative, but you can get the kind of variation that you need in terms of people's news habits. And so if you're interested in that, you can it might be useful to take a look at the document that we put out last year. I see a question from Rich about smaller ethnic community media outlets already or could benefit from this form of analysis. I'm not sure. I don't have a great sense of that, so I can't give you a particular example. I mean, this is not, I also don't want to portray this as somehow like a brand new thing that no one's ever thought of before. I think there's a lot of outlets out there that are, of course, doing focus groups and trying to understand, like what their market is and, like how their journalism is being engaged in the community. So I think there's no reason that this kind of analysis couldn't be kind of transported to even particularly small outlets that are serving relatively small, specific communities. I think the principles that we adopt and sort of follow in this, I think, are still kind of applicable. And then Stella, the survey is actually in that document. We basically included all of the survey questions that we use, so you can actually see a generalized form, a generic form of the survey that's linked in that one of those Lenfest publications. And Liz, I would just actually in the interest of time, just refer you to that how-to guide where we have some discussion of ways to design focus groups to try to get at this. With that, we also have some suggested questions that can serve as sort of orienting devices for those kinds of focus groups and ways to try to structure them so that they're as beneficial as possible. I mean, the other thing I would say about just one more, to do this in the context of a focus group, I think is great because, even with the limitations on, can you generalize to the larger population and all of those reasonable caveats, I think for the investment that you would put into doing something like this. I mean, and certainly there's some economies of scale if you're doing this in a collaborative way with multiple news outlets. But I think the investment that you would have to put in to do this would be pretty small compared to the potential return on that investment that you would get. I mean, part of it is that I think, like as most of you probably know better than me, being able to demonstrate that you have some systematic evidence for the contributions that you're making, I think is just really important for funders, but also just other kinds of stakeholders to be able to demonstrate that you're sort of taking seriously the idea that we want to try to actually sort of demonstrate that this work is doing the things that we think it's doing. So it's easy for me to say because I'm not the person involved in the day-to-day work of the journalism or helping organize these kinds of things. But I do think that I think there's a relatively big payoff given the relatively small investment that can be made to do this even on a small scale.
Yeah, Danny, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you so much for hanging on. I know people are going to have to start jumping off, so please, do what you need to do. But thank you all for being here so much. I'll hang out for, a couple minutes if anyone needs anything. But yeah, Danny, thank you again. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for
Thank
coming.
you.
Hi, Danny. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I don't want to bother you too much, but I was trying to find the full survey and the report links. I didn't see it. I think they only show executive summaries of those reports. It's not like the full research with all the stats.
So say what you mean about.
Sorry.
Maybe I misunderstood what you were interested in.
I'm interested in the full survey. So all the questions you asked me.
You mean with the results, or just that you just want the survey questions?
The survey questions. I'm just curious, what questions that were asked.
So
and I guess the full report as well.
Well, so I mean, the most detail for the report is in the first link that Amy put in the research report. But then if you look at the how-to guide, if you go down to about halfway through, there's a section called Designing a Questionnaire, and there's a little link there that says Survey Questions. And if you click that, it'll show you a Google Doc that has basically a template for the survey that we used.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much. I missed that. Sorry about that.
Oh, sure. I think it's a little bit hard to see in the way the report's laid out, but yeah. So hopefully that'll be useful for you.
That's helpful. Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
All right, you too.